So what we're looking at here, I know it says 1763, 1776. The revolution, y'all, make sure you understand, actually starts in 1775 in April. In fact, we just had the anniversary, was it yesterday, of the first shots of the revolution at Lexington. So, and it's over a full year. It's like 14 months, y'all, until we actually declare our independence. A lot of people get that mixed up, right? A lot of people think we declared our independence and then we had a revolution. But in fact, we were fighting in a war for independence for over a year before we finally took the necessary step and declared our independence. The other thing too is the very name revolution. Some people prefer the term the war for independence because when they see a revolution or they see the term revolution, they think of like the French Revolution or the Russian Revolution, where there was a vast overturning of government, that there were all kinds of major societal and government changes. Some people kind of poo-poo the American Revolution, like it wasn't a revolution. French Revolution, Russian Revolution, Chinese Revolution. Now those were revolutions with lots of people getting killed. Okay. And a lot of people just see our revolution as basically switching the British for American leaders. And there is something to say for that. But at the same time, you should be aware that some historians think of the American Revolution as one of the most successful ever because it's still in effect. The country these people created is still the government that runs the United States. The French government, y'all, has gone through 2 or 3 different republics. The French revolutionaries began to consume themselves. The Chinese, have changed quite a bit. Obviously, the Russian Revolution, the Soviet Revolution, has been overthrown. So, and I think one of my favorite quotes is the American revolutionaries, they died in their beds of old age. They didn't get guillotined or shot by firing squad or thrown into gulags. And so in some ways, this revolution has lasted the longest. And maybe that's because of the modest changes that it offered. So I'm going to start off here, y'all, with a little song, all right, by Tracy Chapman. Don't you know, talking about a revolution sounds. Don't you know, talking about a revolution. All righty, so there we go again. Now notice the years. This has 1754 on it, the handout that I gave you. That marks the beginning of the French and Indian War. 1763 marks the ending of it. And there's a whole big argument there. Remember when we taught in class about the French Indian War, one of the things some people said was it was the war that made America. Definitely a lot of the conditions that are going to lead to the revolution, y'all, are going to come out of that. A question that you guys might have was this revolution inevitable? Was it destined to happen? I think ultimately the Americans, as Canadians and Australians and New Zealanders, would have had to have some sort of breaking with the British Empire. I mean, it was going to happen. Did it have to happen when it did? Did it happen to happen so violently? Probably not, but definitely Americans were outgrowing their, it's kind of like, when we were colonies, we were like kids in a crib. Well, the kids had kind of grown up, right? And it was time for the kids to leave, okay? Now, back when I was a student, we would have seen film strips talking about the American Revolution. I just kind of want to give you guys an idea of sort of the dryness of that. Now, the information is good, but the way it's portrayed is doggone boring. So here we go.
The war in Europe and America had left England with a huge national debt, and it was felt that the colonies should pay their fair share. King George III and his ministers devised a new system of taxation for the colonies, not only to pay for the war, but to make the colonies once more enrich the mother country. The war, however, had done much to develop the strength and resistance of the colonies, who had come to realize that their only real security and independence was in their unity and joint cooperation.
Beep.
In addition, the valuable military experience gained from the French and Indian War prepared the colonists for war and produced such leaders as George Washington.
Yay.
The war also prepared the colonists for the Revolution by revealing to them their own fighting ability and by showing that the British regulars were not invincible. It was, therefore, a logical result of the history of the colonies that they would resist control from afar and seek to develop their own independent resources. Most Englishmen at that time, however, did not see this. George III was in full control, and his meddling in state affairs, his impractical and fickle plans, and the short-sightedness of his supporters were in large measure responsible for the events that ensued.
Okay, so that's kind of the way that we would have been taught with the film strip that clicked, y'all. So it is somewhat better for you. And then, of course, this song probably won't play. Yeah, it's not there. But, you know, this is going to be some breaking up hard to do. And as I call it, the War for American Independence or the War for Independence. Like I said, these aren't in your notes. I just am kind of going to go ahead and talk about some of these things. Now, let's just kind of look at the comic book here, y'all. I mean, excuse me, the graphic novel, which is actually written by a PhD lady historian and goes over some of the major points, okay? Now, the first page, you can just kind of read some of the generalities there. One thing leads to another and that kind of thing. And then we see Samuel Adams, who we'll talk about as an important leader. You know, he says here, if our trade may be taxed, why not our lands? Why not the produce of our lands and everything we make use of? If taxes are laid on us in any shape without our having a legal representative where they are laid, are we not reduced from the character of free subjects to the miserable state of predatory slaves? And we hear that a lot where we're comparing ourselves. If they really knew what a life of a slave was like, wouldn't be a really fair comparison. But you will hear that quite a bit. Now let's see here too. The next page, page 118 of your comic book thing here, goes through some of the major figures of the revolution. Obviously, you guys need to know who Samuel Adams is. We'll talk more about him. He was really the propagandist leader. And I don't think if there's a Sam Adams, there is an American Revolution in lots of ways. You know, he's the leader of propaganda. He is the guy who organized the Sons of Liberty, which was a very effective protest group. Some might even call them terrorist in some ways. He also set up the committees of correspondence. You should know that the committees of correspondence were basically sort of like a news channel. It was like if they'd had Facebook, y'all, it would have been a social media site where they would spread news and information of the latest British outrages. He's the guy who comes up with the Boston Tea Party, which we'll talk about later, and even a signer of the Declaration. Franklin, y'all, is there for everything, right? He negotiates the alliance that gets the French to join us in this war. He also, of course, helps negotiate the Treaty of Paris, the second Treaty of Paris, not the one that ended the French-Indian War, but this one. And, of course, he's going to play a major role in writing the Declaration as well as the Constitution. George III, boo, he's, of course, the enemy, right? He is the guy. And we've really overstated his tyranny. He wasn't a very smart guy, y'all, to be honest. He definitely had some mental health issues, especially later in life. But, of course, as we've seen with World War I, you really try to make your enemy into a monster. And we even did. We called him like the royal brute and all kinds of things like that. Jefferson is given the most credit, obviously, for writing the Declaration of Independence. Abigail Adams, especially important if you guys are going to talk about ladies in the American Revolution. As you guys will see, she'll write an important letter to her husband. John Adams was pro-independence before anybody else. Some people consider him sort of the father of independence, because he is the one that already knew we had to be independent. He just had to convince the rest of us. And of course, ultimately, he's going to be part of the group that writes the Declaration of Independence and finally become president on his own. The Marquis de Lafayette, Doubt they would ask about him. But of course, he's a French nobleman who comes over and helps the United States. He fights for us. He brings troops. And of course, in some ways, he was kind of like George Washington's son that he never had. Thomas Paine. Oh my gosh, obviously, you got to know Thomas Paine. A couple of times, he really comes through. Now, later, we'll kind of tire of the guy, kick him out. He'll go to France and that kind of thing. But common sense, as you guys will see, is so important because along with John Adams, he helps turn Americans against the British and to realize we need independence. Not just to kind of go back to our old system or maybe being given some rights, but we need to be physically separated. And then later, y'all, when the American Revolution isn't going too well, he will write a very, very important work that Washington will read to his men to rally them. And then obviously the indispensable man. Some people call George Washington that, y'all, because without him, we don't have probably a United States like we do. We don't have a president. And on Thursday, when I talk about Washington, he is the guy, y'all, who set the pattern for all of our presidents in the future. He set the precedent for the presidents, okay? Remember, he got his experience in the French Indian War. He is going to be the commander-in-chief of our army, the Continental Army. He's going to save it, keep it going. He doesn't necessarily win a lot of victories. He wins enough, but he keeps from losing his army. And, of course, he earns the title Father of our country. Now, one of the first problems that we have, and I'm going to see if I can go to the this here and show this instead, y'all. Let's see here. Is it going to open up that? This is obviously the other one. It should open up my, let's see here. Where's the comic book? Here we go. Come on, open up, buddy. And it's in living, beautiful color there. So maybe this will be better for the video until I can get to some of the things. All right, so an overview of the causes. One of the big things that AP kind of likes you guys to think about is, was the American Revolution over political reasons? You know, this idea to have our own freedom, or was it more about economics, right? And of course, as you guys know, it's always a mixture of things, but AP could ask you, to what extent was this a revolution over political grievances? To what extent was it a revolution over economic ones? And there's even some people that make it into a revolution due to religious reasons. And those of you in ACDEC will learn about that next year as well, too. So the overview. For one of the things, y'all, is Americans had been undergoing benign neglect. If you guys remember when we started off this year, way, way back in the day, we talked about this idea of benign or salutary neglect. Now, benign is B-E-N-I-G-N. Benign means good. It means not harmful. Remember, the British had kind of left us alone. As long as we were making money, we were sending them raw materials, and we were buying their stuff, they were relatively happy. But eventually, a new king is going to come along, and as we'll see, the French Indian War is going to change all of that too. There's also the problem that James Otis is kind of a forgotten hero of the revolution. James Otis came up with this phrase, taxation without representation is tyranny. The idea that we could be taxed, which the British began to do super seriously after the French Indian War or 7 Years' War, that idea is going to be central, right? You know, no taxation without representation and those kind of things. And as you're going to see, the British also, y'all, are going to deny us our right to trial by jury and that kind of thing. And there's going to be an attack on individual rights. One of the things that's going to help lead to the revolution is going to be something called a writ of assistance. A writ of assistance. Now, writ is like right without the E on the end. So W-R-I-T of assistance. Do you see it right there? Writ of assistance. Now, this Do what? Oh, okay. All right. No problem. So a writ of assistance, y'all, is basically like a search warrant. You guys know the police just can't come bashing down your door without cause. They just can't search you without cause, although they often find a cause. That is written into our Constitution. And I've even seen it as an AP question before where they asked, how were America's grievances that led to the revolution answered by the Constitution? Well, obviously, the Bill of Rights forbids unreasonable search and seizures, them just being able to come in, and of course, the people's house, the Congress, particularly the House of Representatives, it alone has the right to tax people. Now, when you think about it, taxes in a lot of ways, y'all, are both an economic and political cost. I mean, think about it. If your parents made you guys work and then they just took away that money and spent it however they felt, you guys wouldn't like it. You wouldn't like having your money taken away, but it wouldn't be as bad if your parents kind of asked your permission, if your parents used it for your benefit. And so a lot of Americans didn't like the fact that their money was being taken away, and yet they did not have any representatives in the British Parliament, right? The British believed, as you guys will see, in a concept known as virtual representation. Now, we just can't say only the British believe that. In some ways, we still believe it. Do we have anybody in Congress, y'all, that's, say, under 25 years old? No, right? You got to be a minimum of 25 years old to be in the House of Representatives. And yet, they claim they represent you guys because they're smart, they're educated, they can do that. For a long time, women, African Americans, Indians, y'all, weren't represented in our Congress. We believe that other people could represent them. So the British weren't alone in this idea that just because I'm not this particular ethnic group or I'm not this particular geographical group, that I can't represent Americans, okay? And so to me, taxation is both an economic and a political cause as it shows up here. Now remember too, y'all, the British had been using a policy known as mercantilism. Basically, the more gold, the more silver you had, the better. And so the British, y'all, had a system that very much favored the British. The way it would work, as you guys probably remember, is Americans were committed to selling their raw materials at a pretty cheap price to the British, who would then make them into manufactured goods that the Americans pretty much had no choice but to buy from. Now, there were benefits to mercantilism. Every American had a market. The British accompanied British ships protected American ships as they traveled back and forth from pirates and stuff like that. So there were definitely benefits that way. But the main reason for mercantilism was not to help the colonies, not to help them grow up, but to help the mother country of England. And so this system that took advantage of America in lots of ways was definitely a reason. Now, part of mercantilism, y'all, had to do with the very hated, although not very much enforced, navigation laws or navigation acts. Now, these navigation acts required Americans to basically sell to the British. If you wanted to sell to the French, well, you had to go through a British port, you had to pay taxes, you had to do all those kind of things to be able to do it. And if we wanted to buy, say, French tea or Dutch tea or something from the French, once again, it would have to come through the British and that kind of thing. Also, the ships had to be made, a certain percentage of them made in America or Britain and crewed by them. Now, for a long time, you need to be aware, though, even though these navigation acts had been passed going back some time, they were generally unenforced. Americans, as we've said before, the best way to get in America not to do something is to tell them to do it, and they won't. And so Americans, y'all, very, very quickly found ways to smuggle in foreign goods or send their goods to other places. And we bribed officials all the time. hey, I'll give you a case of this tea if you let me load this Dutch tea. Or when we had a trial of a smuggler, the smuggler had a jury of his peers, because that was one of our rights under the British system, a jury of your peers. Well, what if those jurors were customers of yours or people who benefited from it? And so the British, if they did arrest somebody and did try them, they often got really, really frustrated. And of course, under benign neglect, and I've compared this a lot, y'all, to a kid who grows up and has everything. I mean, basically, his parents leave him alone. You know, he feeds himself, he pays his bills, he does his own clothes, he cooks his own meals, he makes his own hours. And so Americans under benign neglect had really gotten used to running things on their own, you know, having free enterprise where they could trade. But then, y'all, we're going to get a new king, George III. And, you know, once again, like I said, he wasn't as bad as we have made him. But a lot of people, you know, kind of see George III as like the bad stepfather. You know, you get a new stepfather who comes in and he's going to start enforcing rules. You got a 9 o'clock curfew. You can't walk across the street without permission. You can't do anything. And it's going to be you're going to rebel against that. Now, if you've lived in that kind of world all your life with strict parents, as I did, thanks to my brother who was crazy and wild, you know, you don't really feel you don't feel very weird about that. But if you're used to your freedom under benign neglect, as the Americans were, and somebody comes to power, you're going to have some real issues. Now, we talked a lot about in my class the French and Indian War. I don't want to rehash that, but definitely remember some basics here. It begins in the Ohio River Valley. Remember, most of the Indian tribes were on the side of the French. Remember how we spent a lot of time at the beginning of the year talking about how the French were much nicer and got along better with the Indians. The exception were the Iroquois, who tended to side against the French, their old enemies. Now, one other thing to make sure you're aware of, because this sometimes comes up when we talk about colonial unity, in Albany, New York, 7 of the colonies got together. Benjamin Franklin, once again, this dude is everywhere. He comes up with this plan that would give Americans some sort of independence. We would work together. You see Franklin's famous cartoon, Join or Die, with the snake severed in pieces. Americans would work together for their own colonial defense. Most Americans didn't like that. They didn't want to lose that sort of independence that they felt as individual colonies to make decisions. And the British didn't want Americans to start thinking of independence in the first place. So it failed. We also mentioned, of course, Braddock and his defeat and the embarrassment there. Now, that little slide thing that was on there, this could definitely be something useful to y'all, is the British Army had a reputation, kind of like the old Roman legions, of being unbeatable. Although the Roman legions did get beat, but we just forget those stories. The British were unbeatable. And yes, indeed, they did win the French and Indian War, but we saw them make lots of mistakes, like General Braddock getting defeated. And Americans are going to get this feeling that, you know, hey, what? We can maybe beat these British guys. They aren't so beatable or unbeatable. Now, in 1763, the war finally comes to an end with what's known as the Treaty of Paris. This is the first big Treaty of Paris. It's an amazing change. If you guys remember, look at all this territory here that had been French. Well, when that war's done, y'all, everything east of the Mississippi River to the Appalachians that had been French becomes British. And ultimately, with our victory in the Revolution, that territory is going to become American. The territory that was French west of the Mississippi was given temporarily, it turned out, to Spain. So France is basically off of the continent, y'all, for most purposes, right? And so that's a big, big deal, all right? Now, we go here, and as this says correctly, the French and Indian War changed everything. What you have to remember, y'all, is this war was incredibly expensive. The British national debt doubled. And suddenly they're going to have to pay for this. And not just pay for this, but as we'll see, they're going to have to keep troops here. Now, in the British mind, the troops were there to prevent the French or the Spanish from trying to come back. Also, the troops were there to keep peace with the Indians. But to the colonists, all these British troops there, they look like prison guards to them. And the British were going to ask us to pay taxes, to pay for these prison guards? No way. The big thing that the French and Indian War does, y'all, is it ends salutary or beneficial or benign neglect. The British now have to start paying attention to us. The colonies that had been feeling kind of independent while the British were busy with their own things. The British had a civil war in the 1640s. They were involved with other wars with the French and Spanish and other places. They were kind of just busy, kind of like, once again, your mom, your dad, after a divorce, let's say, has a new love interest, and they don't have a lot of time for you. So you start running things yourself, and now suddenly mom or dad wants to get all in your space and all of that kind of thing. So after 1763, y'all, the British had a lot more territory that they would have to govern. And they're going to begin a series of actions that are going to directly lead to the American Revolution, okay? Now, one of the key things is this guy coming to power, George III. Now, he's only 4 or 5 years older than you guys, and he's suddenly King of England. Now, his father and grandfather, George I and George II, had actually come from Germany as the Hanovers. And they had taken over, and he did have a very domineering mom who, you know, him being a young guy, his mom puts a lot of pressure on him saying, you need to really rule, okay? Don't just, be a king. You need to act like a king. You need to really control these guys. And so, like I said, he's often painted, even by me, as sort of this crazy new stepdad who's going to really show these colonies what to do. And he does turn out to be a relatively inflexible kind of guy. He does end up going pure insane, by the way, y'all. He lived a long time, but at least he went crazy. Now, George III here, he does have a lot of people that were known as the king's friends. Now, they weren't really able to handle these British Americans. Once again, it's like you've got some kind of wild and crazy kid and you don't know what to do, what medicine to get them, what to do. And so they've got some real problems. And one of these problems, y'all, was going to be what's called Pontiac's Rebellion. Now, in my class, I talked about this. Do make sure you're aware of what happens with Pontiac's Rebellion. Pontiac was an Indian chief, okay, from the Ottawa tribe, that's misspelled, and he united. And this was something Indians always had a real problem with, y'all, going back to fighting the Pilgrims, going back to fighting the English down in Jamestown or Virginia, was trying to unite Indians that hated each other almost as much as they hated these Englishmen. So he was able to get a group, a confederation of Indian tribes together and lead a series of attacks on a lot of these British forts. Nearly every British fort, y'all, was attacked, and a lot of them were taken. It came pretty close, y'all, to kicking the Americans back east of the Appalachians, again, the Appalachian Mountains. Now, after this, the British ultimately did win it, but once again, this was an expensive thing. So the British, y'all, passed something, and this definitely would be a political reason for the revolution. The British passed what's called the Proclamation Line of 1763, where basically they draw a line down the Appalachian Mountains, and they say, look, guys, you can't cross this. Now think about it. The Americans had just fought in this French-Indian War. One of the benefits of the Treaty of Paris was that land west of the Appalachians. And a lot of Americans had begun, like Daniel Boone, the famous, character, had begun to cross that and begun to settle in this new territory. Now the Brits are telling us, you can't go there. And of course, this is going to lead the colonists to get really angry too. So this was done without their say. You could say that's a political reason for this. This is definitely economic for some people who want to have land there, maybe who already have land there. And the thing is, y'all, the British send over 10,000 troops. That's going to cost about $1 million in our money today to take care of these troops there. So not only do the British have war debt from the French and Indian War, but they're also having to pay for these Americans. Now, to be honest, to be the devil's advocate, Americans had been pretty lucky. We had not really been asked to pay a lot of taxes. And yet the British people back home are being asked to pay these taxes to keep the British troops here, to protect the Americans and the Indians from each other, and also to pay for this war for that. So the Americans are angry. And as I've said so often, if you want Americans to do something, tell them not to do something. So if you tell Americans, don't cross this line, Americans are going to start doing it. Another thing Americans were worried about is having all these troops here, they saw as a real threat to their liberties. You know, you just don't feel the same. You feel like pretty soon they might take over. And ultimately, y'all, having those troops there is going to lead to something called the Boston Massacre, right? Okay, now the second big problem that we were going to have, of course, were these taxes. Now, the British are going to go through finance ministers like some people go through boyfriends and girlfriends. King George needed to find some way to pay this. His British subjects were already paying 1 out of every 5 pounds they made, y'all, to the government. They really felt like Americans weren't paying their fair share. That's something we hear all the time. So Lord Grenville, who was prime minister, is going to come up with a plan here to try to get some money out of the Americans, okay? And he was angry that these Americans were smuggling in sugar from the French islands. They were buying tea from the Dutch, and they weren't paying their navigation acts. Now, you did have some Brits. Once again, we often paint the Brits as all the bad guys. You did have somebody like Edmund Burke who said, look, you know, we've always had the right to tax externally. That is, on goods we send the Americans, but internal taxes, he said, no, we can't do that. So the British, y'all, are going to pass one of their first acts is the so-called Sugar Act. Now, sugar did not have the substitutes it does today, you know. And you got to remember, y'all, sugar was kind of, I hate to say it, but like the crack of its time. People had to have it, right? And so, you know, it placed taxes on sugar, but also on molasses. Now, molasses, y'all, was like kind of this liquidy sugar. There's even a saying, slower than molasses. Like if you pour it, it comes out like syrup almost. Molasses, y'all, was used to make rum. And these people drank like fish, let me tell you. And so they were really, really unhappy with that. Plus, and this is very, very important too, the Americans are going to mention this in the Declaration and guarantee that you and I have a right to a trial by jury. Now, remember how I said a lot of Americans, if they got caught and they had a jury trial, the jury, made up of Americans like themselves, were very favorable to them. They often would let them off with a slap in the wrist, if even so much for that. And so what the British did was change that. Now, if you got caught for smuggling, you wouldn't be tried by a jury of your peers, people like you. There would be a judge, an admiralty judge, who got paid by the British, who would make that decision. So no longer could Americans bribe or intimidate their way out of this. So the British are getting serious about this kind of tax. And so you see two political complaints: taxing without our permission, which we call tyranny, or also having trials, at least for smugglers, without a jury of our peers. Okay? Now, the next one that comes up is the dreaded Stamp Act. This is another one that you should be aware of just a single year afterwards. So the Sugar Act, y'all, really kind of fails to do what it wants. It doesn't really quite raise the money. So the British, y'all, go to another tax. This becomes the Stamp Act. Now, it wasn't a tax on stamps like you used to mail snail mail or something like that. This was a stamp on all official documents and on publications. Let's say you got married. Let's say you got divorced. Let's say you got a diploma. Anything that was official, you had to pay a few pence, a few cents to get a stamp on it, or it was no longer official. Even playing cards, y'all, had to have it. Newspapers had to have it. And so you anger two groups of people you don't want to anger. You anger journalists who didn't like the fact that their newspapers now were costing more and more, and they had to charge a higher price for it, and lawyers who now had to pay for all this. Those are two groups that particularly were impacted by it, as well as just average citizens who now were paying more for so many things. And we see this quote here from Isaac Barr, who was an English parliamentarian. He said, "Americans are sons of liberty, and they won't surrender their rights without a fight." And indeed, one of the first protest groups, and you guys absolutely have to know these guys, were called the Sons of Liberty. And you should also know, because they love to ask about the ladies had their own version of the group called Daughters of Liberty. Now, the men's group tended to be a little bit more violent, okay? Now, they used pamphlets that they put out telling people that it was wrong that the British do this kind of thing. The British didn't have the right to tax us. They also used intimidation of stamp collectors. I'll show you a video here in just a sec of what's called tarring and feathering and writing somebody out on a rail, and it's pretty doggone graphic. Now, women, y'all, for the most part, chose in economic protests. Rather than just intimidating people and scaring them and doing it that way, women did boycotts. They got together and they said, we're not going to buy British goods. We'll buy them from somebody else. We'll start making them here at home. And one of the things they did were spinning bees. Spinning bees where women got together, they talked, and they made their own homespun cloth so they wouldn't have to buy the British stuff. And some of the women also, y'all, could get quite intimidating too. If you noticed one of your friends or neighbors was buying British stuff, you might get all in their face and tell them, what are you doing? You're supporting the British. You know, I mean, it'd be like today if you saw one of your friends was buying a bunch of Russian stuff. You're like, how can you support those people? You know, kind of thing like that. So let me just go back to the PowerPoint here for a sec and show you guys some of the stuff there, okay? Now, I'd already mentioned this idea of virtual representation. The idea that I don't have to be an American to represent Americans, because that was the British answer to, hey, how can you pass these taxes if we're not represented? They're like, but you are represented. Just because I'm some British dude living in Britain doesn't mean I can't make decisions for Americans. And yet, like I said, so that was the British thing. We already mentioned George III here. The King's Men, those were the people, and I think that's really George III. I don't think that's Lord North. These people were the ones who gave the king a lot of bad advice. We've mentioned taxes here, okay? We can let this here just so you can get a little. Now, of course, that's the Beatles song, Taxman. 1 for you, in other words, the tax earner. 19 for me. That's a 95% tax rate, which the British had, y'all, in the 1960s for the richest people. It's one reason so many people left. But Americans were feeling the same way towards the tax man. Mercantilism, by the way, among some of the most famous smugglers, y'all, was John Hancock, who, of course, would be the leader of the Continental Congress that would write the Declaration. And as you guys know, signed his name very large there. And then here you see the various tax acts. Now, the thing I gave you did not talk about the currency tax or the Currency Act. Now, here we have the Sugar Act, right? That you guys saw right there. The British pushed this tax, right? And here we see it. It's not playing the video right, but it's a cool video playing sugar. Now, this one was not on there, but you should be aware of this as well, too. Now, remember, the British insisted we buy from Britain. We buy finished goods. The problem is, y'all, American gold, American silver, because most people used hard currency in those days, was going to Britain. But the British, y'all, were not buying nearly as much from the Americans. So you had all this gold going to Britain, but not coming back here. So some American colonies, y'all, began to print their own paper money. Like this is a 9-pence coin. Now this comes actually after the war. This is from 1781, but Americans started printing their own paper money. The British are like, homie, can't do that. The Currency Act said you can't print money. Also, a lot of Americans, y'all, were basically letting companies declare bankruptcy pretty easy. They would borrow money or they would buy things on credit from the British. And because they didn't have much money, they would declare bankruptcy, and the British went without this. So I think it's important to kind of understand that the Brits, they did have some real problems with what we were doing here. There is a British side to it. As in most things, y'all, there are two sides. We as Americans, we tend to only paint this as, oh, the colonies were being so abused and such terrible things were happening. There was definitely a share of that. But the Brits did have some legit gripes, y'all. Now, the Stamp Act, okay? Basically, we mentioned this, but what this meant was, well, we'll probably not show this video because it goes on a little too long, but the Brits, y'all, required us to pay.
Americans will pay a small tax.
Yeah, here we go.
Not to their local legislatures, but directly to England.
That's the first thing that one has to say, looking back on it, seeing now, as we must do, that this was the opening of something which was going to be very big and very important, is that nobody realized that at the time. The British government had a variety of bits of legislation.
The British people themselves, y'all, already paid a stamp tax. They didn't think there was any problem making Americans do so.
Piece of legislative program of 1765, tidying up various details of the administration of colonies, but it wasn't really a subject of vast interest. It was rather technical. It was extremely remote. If you would stop the average man in the street and say, "What do you think about the Stamp Act, my man?" He was at war.
Okay, so, but to Americans, it was a big deal because Americans, y'all, if we've been asked to pay taxes, we paid them to our own local legislature. They passed the laws telling us how to do it. Once again, it's a question of, are you even considered? Are you represented? Now we're being asked to pay this.
All through the 17th.
Okay, so the Sons of Liberty, y'all, these were led by Samuel Adams, as I've mentioned. And here you see a very famous picture that I've seen on AP test before as well, too. Now, their tactics today, you and I would probably consider them almost characteristic for what they did. They, for example, might find a British official, somebody who was there to collect the taxes, to sell the stamps, and they would be awful to them. One of the things that they would do is take castor oil. Now, castor oil comes from castor beans. And if you drink it, you start pooping, right? Pretty doggone quickly, okay? It's a really messy, I guess I could say, a crappy thing to do to somebody. All right? All righty. So what they would also do is find the homes of the officials and sack them. Sacking them, y'all, means you go in, you steal their stuff. What you don't steal, you smash it up, okay? Now, besides just pouring castor oil down somebody's throat, you see what's already happened to this gentleman, and it's called tarring and feathering. Now that's John Adams. Now they're riding him out of town on a rail. Now that's pretty awful, right? I mean, you would not want to be a stamp collector or tax collector after that. Basically, you were stripped nude, as you saw there, okay? They poured hot tar on you, hot enough that it might actually burn you pretty badly. And then, of course, while that tar was still wet, they would dump a bunch of feathers, goose feathers, chicken feathers. There were lots of feathers around in those days, and that would stick all over you. Then they would take you out of town, drop you off there, and of course, as it hardened, if you tried to peel it off, it might take off layers of skin. People might actually suffocate because your body doesn't really have any way to do it. So that's what I mean, that these could be some pretty nasty techniques. And as a result, not too many people wanted to be the tax collectors as well. Now, I'm just going to mention some people here. Paul Revere. If you're an ACDEC, you're likely to see this painting next year. This is by Copley, one of America's, from Dave Chappelle. All right, so more about the stamp tax. So what do the Americans respond with this? They respond with what becomes known as the Virginia Resolves, okay? Now, this is where Patrick Henry makes a very, very famous name for himself and essentially threatens the king, which is a serious, serious offense. It's not like today where you can make fun of the king or queen and there's not a big deal. This was a serious threat. Remember, the British, just 120 years before y'all, had beheaded Charles I after the British Civil War, okay? Now, the Virginia Resolves basically said Parliament does not have the right to impose these taxes on Virginia without Virginia's consent. And in his speech, he says, remember the fate of Caesar. Remember, Caesar was killed for being a tyrant, and Charles I also executed. Like I said, that's an implicit kind of threat. Now, what we form is what's known as the Stamp Act Congress. After the Albany Congress, y'all, this is one of the most famous actions that we do. Now, remember, Albany was just 7 colonies, and none of them in the South. The Stamp Act Congress had 9 colonies that met in New York, and they agreed to what was called the Non-Importation Agreement, where they basically agreed as a whole to stop buying any British goods. You know, this wasn't just a voluntary thing anymore. This was something that their local representatives were now advocating and demanding of the citizens. So what's interesting, y'all, is, let's see if it has that on here. The next thing, if we go back to the comic, let me look here a little bit, okay? Stamp Act Congress. Now, I guess we'll go through the different acts, but I do want to mention that the Stamp Act Congress, y'all, the boycotting, the intimidation of British officials does have its desired effects. A lot of your British merchants who made their living selling stuff to Americans found their profits going way down. And they are the ones that put the pressure on King George and his men, the king's men, to repeal the Stamp Act. And so the Stamp Act, you guys need to know, is repealed. Not so much, you know, I guess we could say, of what the Sons of Liberty might be doing to tax collectors, but really the boycotting itself, the not buying. So the Americans had learned, if we don't buy British stuff, if we intimidate, the Brits will back down. So the colonists had learned a dangerous lesson. Now, because of all the problem with these stamp collectors being attacked, y'all, and because of the cost of maintaining 10,000 troops in the colonies, the British decide, hey, let's find a way to save some money. So what we're going to do is require Americans to quarter. That means for you to keep in your house British troops. Now, most of us have an extra bedroom or a couch or something like that. But think about that. Now you got an extra mouth to feed. Now you got an extra bed that you got to have in there. Maybe the British soldier thinks your daughter is a cute little guy, okay? Some of these British soldiers weren't necessarily the best of men. And to see them, in your house causing problems made Americans unhappy. Now, so the British are going to require that. So what do? There were some protests. And the other thing is, too, y'all, when these British soldiers, like in Boston, started moving in, these lobster backs, that was our word for the British, y'all, because in the British Army, the British Army used a lot of violence against their soldiers. Whippings, like in their Navy, were very common. And some British soldiers were whipped so badly, y'all, that their backs were rough with sores and things, and they were red like a lobster when you cook it. The other thing, too, is we didn't like the fact that sometimes these British officers were publicly whipping these folks out there. It just was intimidating seeing all this, okay? And so this is going to lead ultimately to the Boston Massacre and problems that way. All right, so let's talk about what happens with the Stamp Act, because this is also important. The British do announce that they're repealing the Stamp Act, mainly because of the boycott and how much it hurt their people back home. But the British also did what's called the Declaratory Act, and that's very, very important. Now, think of it once again, like I said, with your parents. You're begging your parents, say, to go on a trip for a weekend. Mom, Dad, can I go? Can I go? Can I go? No, you can't go. Please, I'll never ask for anything again. Can I go? Can I go? And finally, your parents say, yes, but. Well, when do you stop listening? You stop listening when they said yes, because they probably come back with, yes, you can go, but this is going to happen. That's what the Declaratory Act was. The British announced that they were getting rid of the Stamp Act, but they wanted the Americans to know, just because we're getting rid of the Stamp Act doesn't mean we still don't have the right to pass binding laws whatsoever. And so Americans didn't really notice that the British were still saying, look, we're getting rid of this tax, but you can probably look forward to more taxes. So the Americans basically ignored that part, but they had learned an important lesson here. Okay, so we'll go ahead and go on past that. Now, the next taxes, y'all, here are the so-called Townshend Acts. Okay, the British had gotten rid of Grenville. Now we get a new guy in by the name of Townshend. Now, because the taxes on lawyers, for legal documents, the taxes on the press had angered Americans, and this is at the top of page 123 if you have the comic book. This was meant to kind of spread the tax out more. There would be a tax on tea. Boy, would that turn out to be important. There was a tax on all manufactured glass, a tax on lead. Lead was used in a lot of things. A tax on paper, per se, and a tax on paint. And also, y'all, the British made it clear, we are going to enforce this. And this is where you get the dreaded writs of assistance, which were basically a general search warrant. Now, the man behind this was Charles Townshend. And he said, look, this is going to raise the money we need to keep the soldiers over there and to pay our debts off. Okay, he thought we would accept it. But a man by the name of John Dickinson, and sometimes this may come up on something, he writes what's called a letter from a farmer in Pennsylvania, which is ironic since he was from Delaware, but Delaware was kind of part of Pennsylvania then. And basically, he said that these external taxes regulating trade were illegal if they were purely being used to raise revenue. That's a kind of deep thing, but basically, it's okay to tax us for various other reasons. But if you're doing it purely for money, he said that's wrong. He said we're basically being slaves, and he urged Americans to be opposed to it. All righty. So we're going to see James Otis, y'all, particularly attack this idea of a writ of assistance. One of your rights is to be safely in your home without worrying about people coming in. There's this famous phrase, a man's home is his castle. You don't have the right to search us without a warrant. Now, Americans took this very seriously, y'all, and in our Bill of Rights, we make it very hard, compared to other countries anyway, for the police to search you, your home, your person. It's a little bit easier to search your vehicle. But the thing is, if we have the right to do so, if we go before a judge, we get a warrant and we specify. That's the Third Amendment to our Constitution and the Bill of Rights. There's James Otis, the man who articulated this whole idea of no taxation without representation and everything like that. As we mentioned, John Dickinson writes the Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania. We see more non-importation movement where Americans refuse to buy stuff. We mentioned the Daughters of Liberty, where they would spin clothes or cloth to make their own clothes and not buy from the British. And we actually start seeing some really violent riots, y'all. John Hancock's ship, the Liberty, had been caught smuggling, and the Americans actually board the ship and free it from the British. Now, all of this violence causes the British to start sending troops, 4,000 troops, which is a lot. When you think, I think Boston's population was maybe about 20,000 at the time, y'all. So imagine, 1 out of every 5 people in Boston being a British soldier. I mean, it was very, very intimidating. And one of the things that I saw on the other slide, but I forgot to mention, is these British troops, y'all, were not paid really well. And the thing is, you have time where you're off duty. What a lot of these British soldiers would do to make a little extra money is get hired in their free time to work off and down in the ports, loading stuff, unloading stuff. Well, the trouble with that is that made them compete with Americans there. And the Americans didn't like the fact, because if you have too much labor, it's always going to push your wages down. So you start seeing some fights between the American dock workers and the British soldiers who they see as taking their jobs. And that, like I said, leads to these soldiers all being sent to Boston. Now, that is at the bottom of, that is going to the Boston Massacre, the middle of page 123. So as we said, 4,000 are sent there. Their job is to make sure the taxes, the Townsend taxes, are collected without violence, okay? Now, in 1770, March of 1770, the revolution is still 6 years away. You're going to see what's called and has been called the Boston Massacre. I like to call it the Boston Massacrito, because it really wasn't nearly as bad as it's been painted. But what happened, y'all, in March, and believe it or not, there was still some snow on the ground in Boston. Now, and I don't know if you guys remember snow. We had it recently. But snow, when it melts, and then when it kind of refreezes and melts, it gets really kind of sticky. So what had happened is some guys had gotten kind of drunk, okay? And they find this one British guy kind of guarding this building at nighttime. They start yelling stuff at him, and they start throwing these snowballs. Now, some of these snowballs, y'all, on the streets had rocks and all kinds of things on them. And they're hassling this guy. Some of them, not a good idea, were even yelling, "Fire! Fire, why don't you? If you had any guts, you'd shoot at us. And they really egg the guy on. Now he calls for help. He yells out. Society was much quieter then. We didn't have all this loud music and loud cars and stuff. And he yells, call out the main guard, call out the main guard. So a bunch of soldiers show up and they kind of form a circle around him. Now the colonists are really freaking out, y'all. They're throwing stuff at these dudes. They're saying stuff. And I don't know if you've ever been to a massacre. I remember my first massacre. But when one person starts shooting, everybody's got to shoot, right? And so the Brits began to open fire. And it was really just something kind of out of control. Their lead officer very quickly went through with his sword, trying to knock the guns down and stop the firing. But it was too late. 5 Americans were dead or would eventually die as a result. Just going to show you guys a little clip here. All right. So let's see here. This is where it happened. And this is rare historical footage.
Send money to England and escalated the violence.
By the way, hit the lights back there.
Both sides knew that a confrontation was inevitable. All that was needed was one spark. That spark would be struck on the night of March 5th, 1770.
Okay, so that just gives you guys a little bit of a clip here.
That evening, a sentry, Private Hugh White, was guarding a customs house located here.
It's gone now, but that's a...
Around 8 p.m., a young apprentice, Edward Garrick, began to taunt White. The taunting continued until White struck Garrick with the butt of his musket. Garrick fell to the ground.
Those of you in class that heard us talking about the Camp Logan riot, kind of similar, right?
On the square.
People don't like their guy being
Many of them had been drinking in the local taverns.
getting their liquid courage on.
The angry crowd surrounded the sentry and threatened him with bodily harm. While the entire town appeared to be erupting, Captain Thomas Preston was in the main barracks, across the street from the old State House, close enough to hear Sentry White call for help. Captain Preston marched in with a small group of 6 privates and a corporal. The British rescue team reached White and attempted to escort him back to the barracks, but they were stopped by a mob of 200 to 300 angry citizens. Hemmed in by the crowd, Preston ordered his troops into a semicircle formation and took a position in front of his men. Several people in the crowd dared the soldiers to shoot.
Never a good idea.
Over and over.
It made the British soldiers feel like they didn't have any courage. You know, they're wanting to fire. They're wanting to answer that call.
Good
but they
last name.
can't. And the crowd knows they can't, so they're daring them.
The ugly demonstration turned lethal when Patriot Richard Palm struck one of the soldiers, Private Hugh Montgomery, with a stick.
They actually had been
Montgomery
competing
fell
for
to the ground,
jobs.
then rose up and fired. Moments later, the Boston Massacre began. The other soldiers let loose with a fusillade of musket fire. 11 of the colonials fell.
Once they fired, the mob retreated. So the soldiers reloaded their weapons, and as the mob had come back in to retrieve their wounded, the soldiers thought that the mob was advancing on them to do them harm. They leveled their muskets at the crowd as if to fire again. When Preston saw it, he immediately knocked up their muzzles, yelling, "Don't fire, stop, don't."
Okay, so but the damage had been done, y'all. Now, so we see that here. And of course, the way this is going to be portrayed, y'all, it's going to be used as propaganda. Samuel Adams, remember the Sons of Liberty guy, he is going to publicize this as a massacre of innocents. And you and I know they shouldn't have fired on these people, but they weren't exactly just minding their own business and somebody just started shooting them for the heck of it. Paul Revere was a silversmith. He's yet to become famous for his midnight ride. But Paul Revere sees, he's basically told to do an engraving. Now, he was more of a silversmith than a painter, as you guys will see. And basically he says, look, I wasn't really there. I don't know what happened. And Sam Adams says, I'll tell you what to paint. And they portray this as the Bloody Massacre. And they send it everywhere.
Everything we know about the
Here's a
Boston
picture of
Massacre
it.
is derived from this engraving. It was created by the famous patriot Paul Revere 5 years before his legendary midnight ride. The widely circulated picture depicts a small group of unarmed civilians being cut down.
See,
by
the
a
British
volley
are
of
even
musket fire.
smiling.
This picture has been reprinted in countless history books and pamphlets and has been the defining image of the incident for over 200 years. But almost everything about this engraving is wrong. The shootings took place at night, not daytime. There was a thick layer of snow and ice on the ground, and the colonists were not the passive victims depicted in the engraving.
Look at the woman there like, oh, the
There was a
humanity.
total of 9 British soldiers at the scene that night, not 8. And most importantly, the picture depicts the British Captain Preston standing behind his men. Here,
Almost like an
Revere shows
execution.
his blatant anti-British bias.
Definitely pointed
The
view there.
witnesses, first of all, placed Preston in front of the soldiers to begin with. The soldiers are lined up very neatly, as if they're firing in formation, and as if they are being given a signal to fire by the commanding
Firing
officer.
squad.
This contradicts the witness testimony.
But it obviously
This makes it
shows
look
the
like
point of view of Revere,
a
right?
massacre.
We have very little information about the victims of this so-called massacre.
Okay, so you see that one there, right? Now, John Adams, of course, soon to become famous, and the second cousin of Sam Adams, very bravely, y'all, decides to defend these people. I mean, that would be like some mass murderer, y'all, needs a lawyer, and you volunteer to defend him when everybody wants to kill that person. There was a real danger. They had to kind of lock up these British guys for their own protection. He defends them, and he's able to get them off on a very, very light punishment. They were convicted not of murder, but of manslaughter, which basically means you're responsible, although not intentionally, for somebody's death. And they branded an M on their thumb, and they let them go. And to a lot of people, that was not nearly enough. Now, what's going to anger Americans is they feel like they gave these guys a fair trial. But afterwards, y'all, the British said, in the future, if any British officer, any British soldier does something that Americans don't like, they're going back to Britain for the trial. We don't trust you Americans to have a trial like that. Here's the engraving, a better picture of it. I don't know if you can see it here, but it's pretty gory with blood pouring out. This dude has his head blown off. There was a guy did have a hole the size of his fist in his head, y'all. There's even a dog down here. Supposedly this is because there were stories of after the massacre, a dog went around licking up the blood of the dead people, y'all. And this woman's like, oh, I can't believe they're just shooting us innocent people. So this is definitely great for point of view. Okay, so the Brits do get rid at least of part of the Townshend Act, but the part that they keep, y'all, is going to be the tea tax. Now, this isn't just necessarily because they made, any money or a lot of money off the tea tax, but it was basically done, y'all, to show, look, we're getting rid of these other taxes. Why? Well, it turns out they had lost nearly 40%, y'all, of exports. Once again, colonial boycott was making the British back down. All the things the women were doing and the men by not buying British goods. But they left the tea tax there just to show we still are boss. We still are running these colonies. Now, in the meantime, we get another important Sam Adams contribution. And we'll go about 15 more minutes, y'all, and I'll let you go because I know you're getting edgy. You want to go too. But what's called the Committees of Correspondence. Now, like I said, this was kind of like social media today. You know how you guys can get, or even today when you text people and you get like flash mobs together or do something like that. in a way, that was an early sort of like a precursor to that. What he did is he gets 80 different towns in Massachusetts, y'all, to set up these so-called committees of correspondence. Now, correspondence means a letter. And so anytime the British did something bad, it's like, hey, did you hear what the British did in Boston? Yeah, that was pretty bad. But hey, did you hear what they did in New York? Hey, did you hear what they're doing in Philadelphia? And this was, y'all, really to keep the anger going, to keep America, because a lot of Americans, y'all, when they shot and killed 5 people, a lot of Americans were like, man, the you know what's getting real here. It's going down. We better chill. And they didn't want to get shot. So it was really important that he kept this anger kind of going for the next 3 or 4 years. Okay. And it's a calm period. There's no more scenes like the Boston Massacre, but at the same time, he's working behind the scenes to remind people of all this. So what was the purpose of these committees correspondence? Warn about incidents, broaden the resistance movement, maintain it, keep it going. And eventually, y'all, there'll be committees of correspondence throughout a lot of the colonies. And it's amazing how quickly news could travel by horse and things like that. They obviously didn't have phones or telegraph, but in a matter of days, you could get a message to Philly. You could get a message to Charleston in a couple of weeks or something. And this was something done to keep the anger going. Then comes the Tea Act. Now, this is one of the most misunderstood acts, I think, around, y'all, because a lot of people think Americans were mad because of the tax on tea that made the tea more expensive. And that's one reason we didn't like it. But what the deal was this, y'all, there was a company, the British East India Company, had the monopoly on tea. Only it was allowed to sell tea to the Americans. Now, Americans, a lot of them prefer Dutch tea, okay? And the thing is, it could be smuggled in, and because of the tax on the British tea, some Americans could get the Dutch tea at a pretty cheap price. So the British come up with an idea, and they really underestimated the Americans. And this is something you could use, y'all, if you were trying to prove the revolution was more political than economic. Because if the Americans purely were doing this for money reasons, this is a way to contradict that. Because what happens is this: the British were worried that this East India Company was going to go out of business because no Americans were buying their tea. So what they decided to do was to go around the colonial merchants. Now, you guys know that when you buy something at a store, the store didn't make it. If you and I go to Walmart, Walmart doesn't make stuff. They have somebody else make it. Walmart buys it from them, and then Walmart acts as the middleman and sells it to you and me. Walmart has to make a profit. The people they bought it from has to make a profit, and that pushes the price up higher. So what the British decided to do was sell it directly to the Americans without these colonial merchants. So you had some merchants get mad, but the deal was this, y'all. If you cut out the middleman, even with the tax, now the British tea cost less than the Dutch tea. So the Americans, y'all, if all they cared about was the price of stuff, they could have bought the British tea and just been happy. And some of them were. So the Brits really thought, hey, the Americans won't mind paying their tax. They're getting cheaper tea than the Dutch tea, and we're getting the tax, and everything is cool and dandy. And they thought we would go with the cheaper tea, but it turned out not to go that way. This is going to culminate, y'all, in the Boston Tea Party. And as I've been doing reading for ACTEC next year on the American Revolution, it turns out, y'all, that several cities had similar events where they turned away ships, or they went in and they broke in and they stole tea. But the Boston Tea Party is the most famous. Now, people were angered about the fact that they were being cut out of selling the tea, the monopoly. The colonists were angry about the Brits trying to trick them into paying this tax. And so like we see in New York and in Philadelphia, they literally said, you will not land this tea here. Now in Boston, the governor, the governor, Thomas, I think his name was Thomas Hutchinson, insisted the tea is going to be landed. There were 3 ships, and they landed there, and they were going to take the T off the next day. Now, the Sons of Liberty, right? Samuel Adams is believed to be the guy who planned this. He had his Sons of Liberty wear some of the worst culturally inappropriate outfits ever. They basically just put makeup on. They put like a black kind of a blanket or whatever blanket they could find, and they said they were Indians. They climbed on board the ships. They broke open the locks on the T, and then they emptied the T into New York Harbor. When it was done, 342 chests of tea had been thrown in the harbor. Now, to a lot of people, y'all, this was super, super serious. Now we were destroying private property. It's one thing not to buy it, but now it's something different to go ahead and break it. Now, what's going to result from this is what's called the coercive acts by the British or the intolerable acts by the Americans. Now, coercive, y'all, means force. Like next time your little brother or sister, you try to get them to do something, they said, I won't do it, you know, and you say, look, you know, do this or else. And like, you're forcing me. And you can say, no, I'm coercing you. Oh, okay, I'll do it. You know, coerce is a nice way of saying force. So what happened, y'all, is the British they go really crazy over this. And a West Point professor that I had one summer, he really compared it in an interesting way. What he said is let's say it's a kid who comes late to class every day. And the teacher just puts up with it. Johnny's late again. Okay, Johnny, you're late again. Johnny, you're late again. And then finally one day Johnny comes in and the teacher's like, pow, and blows Johnny away. Everybody's like, what? You didn't give me a warning. What the heck? You just blew him away. Like, yeah, I got tired of that stuff. That's kind of how it was with the British, because the British, y'all, had put up with a lot of this stuff, and man, do they overreact. It's almost like they shoot the colonists. The first thing, y'all, was the port bill. They literally closed Boston Harbor. Now, Boston, y'all, is a city that lives or dies by what comes to it and leaves from it by the sea. They closed the port till the British thought it would be okay to reopen it again. Also, the Government Act. They literally shut down the colonial legislature and they moved it to another town where the British could run things. They reissued the Quartering Act, more British troops there, more requirement that you watch them, and also this Administration of Justice Act. And that's the one that I was telling y'all that said if a British soldier, British official gets in trouble, he's charged with anything, you Americans have no right to try him. We're going to take him back to Britain because we don't trust you guys. But it was the port bill, y'all. And, you know, once again, I'm going to kind of compare it to a classroom. And you guys in AP classes are somewhat insulated by a lot of this. But I can remember as a student, you know, you're sitting in a class, you just want to get the lesson done. You just want to get through and go on to the next class and get to go home. But there's this jerk of a kid who gets the teacher mad every day. And they're always talking. And finally, the teacher loses it and like, all right, all of you, you got homework now because of little Johnny, you know. And I remember having that stuff done when teachers would punish the whole class because of little Johnny, and we wanted to beat up little Johnny because he got us all in trouble. And that's kind of the way, y'all, a lot of people felt about Boston. Like, Boston, you're going to get us all in trouble. Boston, man, stop doing this stuff. You're going to get us all in trouble. And then when the Brits came down on them, everybody suddenly felt sorry for Boston. Like, man, we realized Boston was bad, but you guys are trying to starve them out. People started praying for Boston, having a moment of silence. Suddenly, Boston becomes a victim as a result of this coercive act, or as the Americans called it, the intolerable acts. Now, we're getting close to finishing, fortunately, here. This is an act that really wasn't that bad, but Americans took it really, really seriously. Now, the Brits, to their credit, y'all, were trying to be decent by the French, who were still living in what is today called Quebec, or as Americans call it, Quebec. Now, what they decided to do was to extend the boundaries of Quebec all the way down to the Ohio and the Mississippi rivers, Okay, now some other states were claiming this territory. Also, they gave the Catholic Church preferred status because, remember, the Canadians, y'all, or the French, did have the Catholic Church as a particular state church. They also, Quebec did not have a trial by jury. So the colonists, y'all, start thinking if they're doing this to Quebec, which actually most Quebecers favored, they're going to be doing it to us. So this had been the boundary, y'all, of Quebec before. Now it was extended all the way down here. This was American territory that would be taken away. Now, as we said, this is the Coercive Act, closed Boston's port until they paid the tax. Yeah. That's cool. Also, Massachusetts lost their right to self-government. We said the British officials could be tried there. And so the colonists, y'all, this time they go super serious. This time they meet in what becomes known later as the First Continental Congress, but we called it just the Continental because we didn't know there'd be a second one. In this case, y'all, every single colony except for Georgia, way down in the south, meets in Philadelphia. They create what's known as the Association. Once again, because it's worked before, we are going to boycott all British trade. They pass what's called the Suffolk Resolves, saying the Brits have no right to do what they did with the Coercive Acts, telling the Massachusetts people, ignore the British, form your own government, start collecting your own taxes. And this is very important. Start forming your own militia. Start storing up ammunition. And of course, that's going to lead to what we'll talk about next time, the Lexington and Concord things. And finally, Americans, y'all, because a lot of them are still hopeful, they write up something called the Declaration of Rights and Grievances. Now, later, the Declaration of Independence is going to list all the things that were ticked off about that the British king had not fixed. This was kind of an early version of that. We're saying, this is why we're defying you. From the moment we first came over here to Jamestown, you had promised us that just because we were Englishmen living in America, we wouldn't be losing our rights. We would still have our rights. And so they do that. And of course, our rights, y'all, as Englishmen go all the way back to the Magna Carta. So here's that First Continental Congress. This says 55. Something else said 56. How to respond. This is the room where they met, where later the Declaration and Constitution would be written. In October, the Continental Congress adjourns. They say, let's meet again in 6 months. We'll meet in May. And if the king does not answer, because remember, y'all, a boat has to go over to England. That's going to take 4 to 6 weeks. The king has to respond. It's going to take 4 or 6 weeks for his message to get back. Maybe the king will realize if he reads why we're so unhappy, he will do something about it. We are not looking for independence. We only want our rights that we felt that we had been denied. We want representation in Parliament. John Adams is maybe one of the few people who really wanted all of that. And so what they don't know, y'all, is that we are going to have a revolution soon. So the last thing to look at here, y'all, is Patrick Henry's famous speech. And Patrick Henry, y'all, gives the speech in Virginia. And his famous words, is life so dear or peace so sweet as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery? Forbid it not, Almighty God. I do not know what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty. And then he actually acted, y'all, as if he were a slave. Or give me death. And he fell to the ground while doing this very, very dramatic speech. And we do see some Brits going ahead and doing it, but the king, y'all, when he gets this letter, this Declaration of Rights and Grievances, he doesn't decide that, hey, maybe they're making a point here, let's ease up on them. This is like a parent, y'all, who has a kid defend themselves. How dare you speak back to me, colonists? And he declared us to basically be in rebellion. He said blows, in other words, fighting, must now decide whether they are to be subject to me and Britain or they're to be independent. And this, y'all, is going to set up finally what's going to become known as Lexington and Concord. Thank y'all for your time. I kept you, I know, 3 or 4 extra minutes. We'll go ahead and stop there. All righty. I appreciate it, y'all. Hopefully it wasn't too miserable for y'all. And we'll end it there.